So what is Framer for those people who might not have heard it?
Okay, what is Framer? Framer is easily, and I say this from a completely unbiased perspective, but I can say it with the sort of conviction of the type of person who's leaving in 3 days' time. No, it's for my money the best code website builder that exists because it acts like a design tool. It acts like Figma, and that's the language that I speak. I grew up using Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign. So these are all concepts that I'm quite familiar with. I understand why Webflow would be more of an easy process for certain, maybe a bit more technical-minded people. But I think the freeform canvas of Framer really gels with people. I think a lot of the confusion about what Framer is that when I joined, it was a prototyping tool. Still with the same freeform canvas, but it was more about making designs that you could play with and you could give to a shareholder and say, this is what it's really going to feel like. And then when I came and made Framer Motion, it really was what it was going to feel like because it was using the real stuff that you could make the website in. But the problem with prototype, this is probably going too deep, but it's interesting. This is essentially how we ended up as a site builder. Apart from having all the raw ingredients, addressable market for prototyping, it's like a very specific niche. And I think the people who love it, like they want a prototype and they see it as a key part of their workflow. But if you imagine the pipeline of design all the way to production, the one bit that's going to go in like an economic downturn or even people that might just skip this step entirely is prototype. It's a nice to have, but it's not really the thing that's you're not going to build a big business off it. But by making an amazing prototyping tool, inadvertently, they'd made an amazing website builder tool. It wasn't even a pivot. I'd say it was only a natural continuation of the tool's capabilities. But naturally, because it's so successful now, the prototyping stuff has just fallen away. And I think that's been quite a natural process from my point of view. But I understand why people still have this confusion. Oh, it's a prototyping tool, but it is a site tool. Was it a Figma competitor? Or what was this? It's a website building tool. And I use it for motion dev. I'm a big fan. Probably, I call myself a super fan at this point, whereas for the first few years, there was almost a meme within the company that like Matt doesn't know what Framer is. He doesn't know how to use it because I was so concentrated on Framer Motion. Whereas now I think I know it better than a lot of people at Framer. Like I use it a lot and I'm a big fan.
So when it was a prototyping tool, were like the animations built in a way that just wouldn't work on normal websites? And that's where your libraries came in and made it production ready from the animation point of view?
Yeah. So what they had before I joined, they had like a code sandbox environment where you had a coffee script API and you work directly with the DOM. So they considered it quite technical. As they moved into more of a GUI situation, they also ported it to React. With that, they didn't really have an easy to use API and the animations weren't in the UI at that point. When I joined, the idea was to make an animation library that was simple enough that a designer wouldn't understand, like the animate prop. That was the cornerstone of the whole API at the time. And to make it draggable, you type drag. These sorts of concepts meant to be absolutely no argument simple. Whether or not we succeeded, I don't know, but that was the goal. The production story was just great that it came out of it. Especially when we made layout animations and Magic Motion, you couldn't hand off a lot of the animations that people were making to a developer because it would take months and months of engineering work to make some of these animations. And you sprinkled all that throughout your app, or you can just use Framer Motion with the layout prop and you can recreate these things straight in. And now, of course, Framer has like the UI around all of the animations and stuff. So even their focus on the API itself is made it a natural situation, given that Framer's getting really successful. They're a big user of it, but likewise, Motion is not bigger in terms of users. It might be, I don't know numbers, but it's bigger in terms of it exists within Framer, but it also serves a certain percentage of the web. And to really serve everyone, that's why it made mutual sense for myself and Framer to part ways. Obviously, they're the big sponsor of Motion and I still work with them closely. But yeah, I think that's also how the exit came about. The enter and the I think I've gone full circle.
Let's like dig more into the library itself now. I think many people try to add animations to their apps and there's so many pits of failure in there. The biggest one being that some properties are GPU accelerated, some aren't. Like most developers don't even know that, which is mind-boggling for web developers. But how does Framer Motion enable you to do things that those APIs don't? Because a lot of those APIs, you can get pretty nice animations out of them, but I feel like you eventually hit a wall.
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is that Framer Motion's like the only animation library that I'm aware of that has a hybrid engine where if a property can be animated via the GPU, it will be. Like we use WAPI for that one. So it always tries to do the most performant thing possible. Same with scroll timeline. If the options that you've given it are possible to run on scroll timeline, then it will do. And that's for both web animations, JavaScript animations, but also if you provide it a function, it will run on scroll timeline and not be polling the scroll position. And because it's the polling the scroll position position is like a read, a DOM read. Again, something that you're right, people shouldn't have to care about that. But if you use it, it's got timeline. And so it's not always there, but basically it kicks in. Anytime it can optimize these things, it will. And anytime that the user's requested capabilities beyond, it will de-optimize down to the JavaScript engine, essentially. And one thing that I've been toying with, I don't know if I'll do it, but it'd be nice to have a strict mode of some sort. Like we have a strict mode, I forgot for a different context, but a strict mode where it's like, if this isn't going to run on the GPU, don't do it. You could imagine starting doing things like that. And that would be relatively simple. If that's something that people want, tell me, because that would be relatively simple to set up the way it all is at the moment. But yeah, I feel like that might have answered your question.
Yeah. I was reading through the docs and it does point that out a few times. Like when you're animating a box shadow, it's like, oh, maybe you want to use a filter instead. What jumped out to me is there needs to be an ESLint rule right here. Currently at my company, I wrote one internally that if you use any of those 28 things that like trigger a reflow, you'll get some yellow squigglies under it. That'd be very cool to see from Framer or from Motion.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's not, I really love that idea because it could happen at runtime. It could happen as ESLint. I really delved into writing my own ESLint rules, but that might be interesting as well. It's funny because it's hard to go. So this is my problem with going hard and fast on rules. So like layout, obviously never animate layout. Actually, layout, it's not always that expensive. For instance, if you've got like a box that's isolated from the rest of the page with an isolation rule on CSS, doesn't have that many children, you can animate width and height. It's probably fine. Like on most of it, 99% of users aren't going to notice this. If you're animating the width and height of a whole page that has like multiple nested flex boxes and grids, obviously it's a bad idea. Same with certain properties. For instance, one of the reasons why animating box is not good is because it triggers paint, whereas you can animate filter and it runs completely hardware accelerated, which is amazing. But there's situations where like, this is very specific, but I've been trying to figure out how to do automatic wheel change in a way that works. I had to take it out in the end because sometimes, especially when you've got a design tool like Framer, but this happens to developers as well. If you've like got a huge layer that's just massive, you don't want to be reading the size of every layer and saying this one's too big. If you apply wheel change to that and it becomes a GPU layer and you're on an iPhone, the browser will crash. But say you're animating transform, I put in this heuristic where it actually turned out I did know the size of this element. So I put in a heuristic that was basically like, if the surface area of this is bigger than arbitrary threshold, then use the JavaScript animations instead. Don't apply wheel change. Don't animate it on WAPI. Do it just via style. And all you're doing is changing the translate X of this element, this huge element. And I thought, job done. And I tested it and the frame rate was obviously worse because now we're painting the element as a change, but that wasn't what was causing the slowdown at all. Like if you look into it, the style recalculations that this was the cause of the slowdown, like 95% of the time of these style recalculations, but I still haven't really got to the bottom of why changing the style attribute could have this cascading effect, especially when there wasn't any rules like style equals this, which could obviously be very dangerous. So I haven't really figured out what it was, but then I discovered that if you animate a CSS variable using WAPI and you register it via CSS register property, which is an upcoming, and you say isolate true, then no other style recalculations get triggered. So what we've done there is purposefully de-optimize an animation off of the GPU and then purposely opted it in. So we're opting it into Paint now, but by then booting it back up onto WAPI via a CSS variable, we're cutting out the style recalculations. And there's all these little tricks. That wouldn't be the advisable thing to do most of the time. I actually think most of the time, if you're going to animate it like that, animate just the translate X via the style attribute. I think if you weren't hitting those style recalculations, it would be faster in most situations. But in this situation, it was faster to do it the other way, because you can still add in other situations that will change animate by JavaScript. Anyway, that's a really long example of saying it's so hard to paint with such broad brushstrokes, like these rules basically. So I always worry about doing linting. Also, there's always best practices, but I've gotten into so many situations where someone's like, this is the best way to do it, and you're basically wrong for not doing it like this. And I'm like, possibly, but the time when it's not wrong, it's the time when it's going to crash the browser, or it's so you get into these conversations. And yeah, so it may be a rule, but it would be an advisory. It'd be a warning, not an error.